Hi. Welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This video will be the third one in a series on Carl Rogers, who's probably the most famous internationally renowned humanistic psychologist of all. More specifically, this video will be focusing on his most famous book, On Becoming a Person, and more specifically yet, on Chapter 1 of that book. In the previous video, what we did was we covered the first half of that chapter, and the goal for this video is to cover the second half of Chapter 1. As I told you in the last video, Chapter 1 consists of two lists of different descriptions of what he thinks is important to psychotherapy, but also more generally to human existence. So, and maybe at this point I should let you know something about how to read and study Carl Rogers, because it's a little bit different from the material that you've heard about before in this class, insofar as there's not as much technical vocabulary and sort of strict factual memory-driven work for you to do. Instead, learning about Carl Rogers is getting a sense for the fundamental values and the fundamental approach to psychotherapy and probably to life more generally. So that's what you should be aiming at. So you're studying for the test on this stuff should be a little bit different. Be going for a more general understanding. And yes, there is a little bit of specialized vocabulary, like I probably will ask you what unconditional positive regard is, for instance. So you should know the relatively little bits of vocabulary that are there, but in a more general way, you should be working toward a generalized understanding. So I do not recommend that you memorize these lists item by item. What I recommend you do is try to get a sense for the overall gestalt, the overall pattern of what he's trying to describe in these lists. Okay, so the second of the two lists, 8 items in this one, he says 8 more personal learnings in the second half of Chapter 1 out of On Becoming a Person. So, number 1, once again, let's remind ourselves of sort of the task here. Rogers has a very simple, straightforward way of saying things, and the trick is to catch the deceptively simple way he has of conveying a fair amount of actual depth. So, number 1, I can trust my experience. My total, easy to mispronounce the next word, organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than my intellect. Okay, so I can trust my experience. My total organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than my intellect. And this may seem like an obvious point to you, but in academic circles, which is where most theories of psychotherapy and psychology are born, it's not necessarily so obvious. And the reason why is we have a tendency to idolize the intellect and the workings of the intellect, and we have a tendency to demote all of our other human faculties. And what he's trying to do with number 1 is try to provide a more balanced sense for, well, what psychotherapy is about ultimately, or even life more generally, as I keep saying. So my total organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than just my intellect. So what he's talking about with total organismic sensing is an emphasis on capacities like your intuition, your gut sense, that sort of thing. So to perceive with one's whole person, which, yes, includes the intellect for sure, but there's a lot more to what we are than our intellect. Okay, so total organismic sensing means to begin to see things holistically and perceive things holistically and interact holistically, where all of our different human faculties are engaged and not just our cerebral capacities. So total organismic sensing, as I said in your notes, means with one's whole person, not just with one's mind or not just with one's feeling either. Okay, so if you're hearing that bell of holism ringing, you're probably hearing the right thing. Number 2, evaluation by others is not a guide for me. Now here I'm always tempted to, I guess, modify slightly the somewhat canonical text of Carl Rogers by saying evaluation by others is not necessarily a guide for me. And the reason why I'm always tempted to do that is because sometimes other people can be right and we can be wrong. All right. And in cases like that, wisdom means being able to perceive that and take it in and live accordingly. So evaluation by others is not necessarily a guide for me. He says it's not a guide for me. But in any case, there's definitely an emphasis on individual choice and perception and values, that's ultimately what it comes down to, right? Like, no matter what other people say, you have to decide whether you take it seriously anyhow. So even if your temptation is just to defer to what other people tell you, well, the thing is you have to choose at some level to defer to what other people tell you. So in a way, you're still thrown back on this whole business of deciding for yourself how to live your life. Okay, so we're each the ultimate judge of what's best, what's right for ourselves, and that includes the client. Okay, so if you're starting to work clinically, it's probably not going to take you very long to encounter a client with whom you're working who consistently does the bad thing over and over again in life. And you can explore that during therapy, and the client can even have some stunning and emotional insights during the process of therapy. But then the problem is that often enough we go back to our old bad habits. And part of the reason for that is because we have to live through something ourselves. It's not just a matter of other people evaluating our behavior and telling us, well, here's where you're messing up, or here's where you're screwing up, right? At the end of the day, we have to make our own mistakes in life. You know, we have to learn by way of our own mistakes, and that's a big important way we learn. So, you know, evaluation by others is not nearly as important as it might seem at first for that reason, because, you know, ultimately we all need to decide for ourselves how we're going to live. So similarly, I say the client is the ultimate judge of what's best for him or her, okay? And whether you like it or not as a therapist, that's what the client is going to do anyhow. So you may disapprove, but guess what? It's the client's life, the client's choice of how to be a human being. So your job as a therapist is not to superimpose your judgment upon it. Your job as a therapist is to accompany your client in a way that they can discover a deeper meaning, okay, and a deeper range of possibilities than the ones they're currently living out. But unless they discover it for themselves, your evaluation from an external position is going to mean next to nothing. Okay, so for that reason. Now, number 3 in the list, I think, is a little bit of a combination of the first two. So experience is, for me, the highest authority. And hopefully by this point in the semester, you're used to hearing the talk of experience and how that is so central to any sort of psychological meaning. You know, so something on the order of subjectivity or experience is ultimately, I mean, you know, hopefully this is not abstract at this point, because this is how we live. You know, we live on the basis of how we experience things. You know, so if we experience things one way, we tend to live accordingly, and we experience things another way, we tend to live according to that. So no matter how, the only truth really then is whether we're going to recognize that reality or not. So a combination of number 1 and 2. Now here's the trick about experience. At first this sounds like, well, if I experience something in a certain way, then it must be true. That's not necessarily the case. And the reason why is because we also have the experience fairly often of being fallible, of being wrong, of making mistakes, and so on. So this sort of emphasis on experience as the ultimate arbiter of what is true and real and how we're going to live our lives also means including within that range the experience of being wrong, of needing correction, of growing, of transcending ourselves, and so on. So really what this is about is not a sort of closing down the sphere of truth to what you personally experience, but a way of opening the horizon of truth to include the possibility of being corrected by life, of experiencing things more deeply than you had before, of the experience of being wrong and needing to revise or retool or even do a direct 180 on what you thought was real before. So really what this is about is an opening to new experiences beyond the ones you already know. So you're not out of the game yet of needing to be corrected by life. In fact, just the opposite. So I say we can fool ourselves in our experience, hence a value to questioning it ongoingly. All right, because you can always be wrong, even about the most, what seem to be the most fundamental and inviolable truths that seem to run through reality and hence through the reality of your life. We can be wrong in the most fundamental ways, and often we are. That doesn't mean that human existence is sort of diminished by that. In fact, really, when you think about it, like being wrong is a wonderful thing because it sets up the possibility of seeing things and knowing things more deeply than we had before, which can be a kind of adventure, like ongoingly, sort of riding the arc of the ongoing adventure, perceiving things ever more deeply, changing ourselves, changing our lives ever more deeply, participating in the changes that other people are going through ever more deeply. So, at first it may seem like, well, that just sucks, the fact that, although experience is the highest authority, that it's prone to error and all of that. Well, says who? Says who? Sometimes, maybe at certain points in our lives, the mistakes we make are the most exciting and interesting part of us. Just a thought. All right, number 4. I enjoy the discovering of order in experience. So here, once again, we find this emphasis on an intrinsic reward and an intrinsic motivation. Okay, to do psychology or to be a psychotherapist. All right, so he says, I enjoyed the discovering of order and experience. So that's really the payoff of being into psychology or any related field where you're trying to understand what life is about, what human existence is about. Like if you enjoy, the real reason to engage it is because you enjoy it. You feel fulfilled somehow in doing that, So we saw that before, I think, in either video number 1 or video number 2 in this series, where we were talking about intrinsic enjoyment. So intrinsically enjoyable to do psychology. And I remember in the previous video I said, hey, if you're really extrinsically motivated, you want to make a ton of money, like learn something like software engineering, because it'll pay you, if that's your thing, that just will satisfy you much more quickly. If that's your thing. I'd like to call into question whether it should be your thing or not, because there may be deeper motives in life. A lot of people who are coded as success and even have a ton of money are really miserable wrecks in all the ways that matter. A wreck of a human being in all the ways that matter. I don't think you need to look too far into the realm of celebrity to see cases of that, with all kinds of addictions and weirdness of their lives. All right, so this is the primary motive, even more so than utility. Utility means being useful, okay? So that you enjoy, it's important for you to enjoy your life, okay? It's important for you to enjoy your career that you're hopefully heading toward. If you're not enjoying your career, guess what? It's never going to satisfy you. You're probably going to collapse at some point in the not too distant future. It's not going to carry you, you're not going to end up going where you want to go if you're not enjoying the career part of your life, So, and here I sometimes like to take things, my wife sometimes says, Nicole that is, sometimes says, like, you like to take things to extremes, she sometimes says. And that's probably true. I have to sort of own that. So in these lectures, sometimes I do that. So the next thing might be a case in point, even to the level of ecstasy. Okay. So enjoyment taken to the extreme, to the level of ecstasy. Why shouldn't you feel ecstasy in your studies as a student? Let's get sort of here and now with it. Like, why does that seem so weird? Like, well, you're writing papers and you're taking tests and you're reading books and you're studying and you're listening to lectures like this one and all that. Like, why shouldn't all of that kind of activity be not merely enjoyable, which is already probably a challenge for a lot of students, but like, why shouldn't it bring you into the more feverish pitches of things like ecstasy? Like, why shouldn't you have a kind of rhapsodic relation to what you're doing as a student? Because if you think about it, well, all you're really doing as a student is living part of your life. So, why shouldn't your life bring you to ecstasy in fairly often? Not that that's all there is to life, because there's certainly a lot more to life than ecstasy. But I think that, to be honest about it, like, I think we tend to set our sights too low a lot of the time, like all of us. I'm not just talking about you students. Us professors, we professors tend to do that too. Like we set our sights too low, and we think that as long as I can get to the weekend and then have some entertainment on the weekend, like that's good enough. Well, maybe it's not good enough. You know, if you really want to sort of get the full value out of your experience of being human in this lifetime, like maybe you should allow yourself to feel ecstasy in your studies, or allow yourself to feel a kind of ecstasy in being a professor, for that matter. You know, like why would it seem so weird and alien to be talking this way? Well, maybe it's because we're too damn used to setting our sights too damn low most of the time, like falling in love with life and questioning life. Why shouldn't that bring us to the feverish pitches of almost orgiastic ecstasy? Like why shouldn't that happen a little bit more often than it does? Well, maybe the key variable in the equation is, oh, let me think real hard. How about us? Okay, and our attitudes and our choices and our responsibility for the quality of our own lives. Just a somewhat subversive thought for you, possibly, for your young mind. Okay, number 5, the facts are friendly. My goodness, only 4 words, the facts are friendly. Like, what could this possibly mean? Well, here's what it means. It's like, ultimately, from his point of view, seeking the deeper truth of things is always toward the good. Okay, I said that kind of rhythmically, so let me say it again in case you were thrown by the weird rhythm. Seeking the deeper truth of our lives and what we're experiencing is always ultimately toward the greater good. The facts are always ultimately friendly. Now, why is it important to say this? Because at first it can seem not to be the case that the facts are particularly friendly, because sometimes we have to confront hard realities within ourselves. Okay? So sometimes, like, confronting the truth can be a terrifying process. You know, and it can make it seem like, well, the facts aren't very friendly. So really what life should be about is constructing more and more elaborate utopian visions of how things should be in the world or in our lives more individually, at the expense of how they actually are. Like, we start living toward our fantasies rather than toward reality. Well, he's saying that ultimately living toward reality is toward the good, even if it doesn't seem like that way in the short term. So even if we have to readjust our thinking or question our investment in our current vision, ultimately it's going to pay off. Changing our minds, entering into process. Okay, remember what we said about this word process in one of the last videos, that this is a code word for him for change, open-ended continual change, transformation, and passing over our already existing limits. So entering into process may be hard, but they're always ultimately worthwhile. Okay, now, so far in this list, we've done 5 out of the 8. I think that it's fairly straightforward, but the next one is not necessarily so straightforward. He goes, what is most personal is most general. Oh my God. Thank you, Dr. Insight, for that stunning bolt of lucidity. What is most personal is most general. It sounds like a damn Zen koan. I think I'm on the edge of a Satori moment any second here. So to sort of flesh it out, I put a quote in your notes to sort of give it a little bit more context, because it's not necessarily obvious what this means. So he goes, I have almost invariably found that the very feeling which has seemed to me most private, most personal, and hence most incomprehensible by others, has turned out to be an expression for which there is a resonance in many other people. Okay, so maybe your experience isn't quite as alien and singular as you think it is. Okay, most of the time. Every now and then you may have a sort of totally out there weird type thought, or a totally out there weird type experience, but maybe 90 or 95% of the time, what you're thinking, what you're feeling, like, other people can relate to it perhaps more often than you think. All right, I remember discovering this, when I was a young software engineer, and I'd be at conferences with, upper echelon administration, like vice presidents and people like that, who are much older and much more experienced than I. And as a consequence, I would often have the feeling that I really shouldn't speak up, because my little 22-year-old insight probably isn't worthy of these other people. And what I found over time is that on the rare occasions where I would speak my truth, most of the time people, as we were leaving the meeting, said, I was thinking the same thing, or I had that thought, but a variation on it. In other words, what I learned was this basic lesson that Rogers is getting at, that, you know, what we are perhaps is more worthy of expression than it seems like at first. Maybe there's less reason for us to sort of be cocooned away from other people somehow than there seems to be at first. So an emphasis on daring to express our experience, because it's probably not as alien and singular as we sometimes think or fantasize. All right, number 7. It has been my experience that persons basically have a positive direction. Okay, this is probably the most contentious element of Rogers' thinking. Well, I think it definitely is the most contentious one. So he's contending that underneath all of the weirdness and warpedness and, you know, in the South we say cattywampus. Sometimes people are a little cattywampus, out of kilter, out of alignment somehow. As much of that as there is in the world, he's saying that ultimately people are good. And that may be a shocking thing if you have ever opened a history book and have come to appreciate like how much hell there is on Earth and how often we human beings go out of our way to generate even more hell on Earth. And that's true not only with respect to sort of the large overarching dynamics of human history, but even in the more personal world. We tend to generate hell for other people and hell for ourselves too with some fair frequency. So it can be a surprising thing to hear that, well, Carl Rogers, who is, you know, this great luminary, at one point he was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize even, is contending that, you know, underneath it all, we have a basically positive direction. So let me try to say something to try to help you appreciate this. What he's talking about here is that ultimately what we're all doing is we're all looking around at the world, at life, and we're trying to notice things that are possible for us to experience that are also reasonably probable if we try to move ourselves toward experiencing them. They're reasonably probable, and we're trying to sort of optimize our lives by looking around at all that and picking the best thing. Okay, now, the other side of the coin is we can sometimes do that in really warped, difficult ways, both for ourselves and or for other people. Okay, so we can do that in really warped ways, for sure. No one's denying that. Rogers is not denying that. But underneath it all is a kind of motivation. Like we want the good in life in one way or another, whether we have sort of a very sort of isolated view, an egocentric view, like good for me, that's still like toward the good. Or we have maybe a more social and holistic view, like good for other people, good for all sentient beings, like Buddhists like to say that. Sentient means anything that perceives at all. Okay, you know, sentire in Latin. Okay, there's a similar word in Spanish. But anyhow, sentirse in Espanol, see? So at any rate, okay, I got thrown a little bit by that. Like ultimately what we're all trying to do is tend toward the good in one way or another. And there are different ways of doing it, and some of them are very warped. That's true. So it's a controversial point, even among humanistic psychologists. This is not necessarily representative of how all humanistic psychologists think. In fact, Carl Rogers and Rollo May, whose book you'll be reading later in the semester, got into a very famous, contentious debate about this kind of thing. So the question is, are we ultimately good? Or, on the other hand, is our nature much more toward the bestial and destructive? Like Freud sort of had this idea that, like, really sort of the layers on the surface of niceness and, you know, altruism and all of that are really just on the surface. And underneath, we're sort of wild, ravening beasts underneath it all. So are we more that way? Or Rollo May's take on it was, well, really, if you're going to be honest about it, we're a hybrid of the two of those. Like we're both constructive, you know, seekers of the positive and also destructive seekers of the negative, and that our ultimate human constitution embodies both of those. And for me, that's the most lucid position of all, for me personally. But this is a really personal thing. You have to decide how you see life, okay? You know, and more specifically, the human form of life. So Rogers, in trying to say something about a common criticism of him, is he says, I do not have a Pollyanna view of human nature. That's on 27 of your reading assignment. A Pollyanna view of human nature is one that sees things in sort of purely positive terms. You know how people sometimes say, well, you see the world through rose-colored glasses? That's a Pollyanna point of view. Okay, so everything is nice, different degrees of niceness, basically. Okay, so he's claiming he does not have a Pollyanna view of human nature. He claims to have a realistic view, and a realistic view would acknowledge that human neurosis and destructiveness are huge forces, but he's arguing that although they are huge, they don't ultimately undermine or undercut people's tendency toward the positive. Okay, so, and moreover, the weird warped stuff about us he sees as the result mostly of toxic social influences. It's sort of like this, like if you look at the lives of most despots or serial killers or people that seem to embody the negative in a big way, almost all of them have just horrific childhoods. You know, so Rogers has noticed that, and sort of the conclusion he derives is, well, you know, probably we're warped as a function of our having really nasty, toxic experiences in the past, and that's what warps us and forces us to deviate from our fundamentally good nature. But like I said, this is a personal thing, so you have to decide for yourself how you see life, all right? Remember what we said before. Experience is the highest authority. Evaluation by others is not necessarily a guide for you. You have to decide for yourself how you see life and consequently how you're going to take up the work of a psychologist, you know, even now in your young life. Okay, so number 8, let's get on with number 8. I'm trying to do these a little bit more quickly because I want to have them fit in this video. So, okay, number 8, kind of a culmination type statement. He goes, life at its best. Now, what he's getting at with life at its best is the sort of the value basis for this entire vision of psychotherapy. Okay, so every view of psychotherapy is based at least on an implicit notion of what the good is in life. Because if there's no notion of what the good is in life, then how do you know whether what you're doing, the work you're doing, is tending toward it? All right, you know, you may be exacerbating the problems, you know, unless you have some kind of idea. So life at its best, what is it? It's a flowing, changing process, there's that word again, in which nothing is fixed. Okay, so fixed here means stationary. Okay, so if you're a young person, don't be too quick to hear that word fixed as meaning repaired. Don't hear it that way. Hear it as stationary. Okay, so let's reread that and I'll substitute the word in. Life at its best is a flowing, changing process in which nothing is stationary. Okay, so life is always in the process of becoming. And what he's saying here is that there's no ultimate destination for any of us. Okay, the adventure of life always continues, no matter how evolved you are, no matter how emotionally or intellectually intelligent you happen to become, no matter, you could become a fully evolved bodhisattva, and life will still offer you up some challenges, right? The adventure never ends. You could live to be 100 years old, and there will still be adventure for you, okay? So there's no closed system, no philosophy, no set of principles, no orthodoxy, no ideology that completely answers the riddle of life. And that's part of the adventure of it, you know, that there's always something more to do. So you may not see life this way, okay? Once again, it's a personal kind of thing. You got to figure out how you see life, because that's going to shape and condition your movement within psychology, or even whether you should be a psychology major for that matter. Like I said before, like if you have a view of life where he who dies with the most toys wins, start writing software. Or do something similar. Okay, maybe you'll be a chemical engineer. I started out as a biochemistry student, and I was thinking of going into chemical engineering because I loved the chemistry part of biochemistry so much. I didn't so much like the biology part, but I was really into math, and you know how kids are that way, and so I loved the mathematization of matter, and I loved physics and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so I guess I was going on a little bit of a digression before the camera turned off, and so let me get back on track. So hence, psychotherapy is not about promoting any preordained order, okay? Like, it's not just about, you know, instantiating whatever sort of values, whatever value system you might have, like trying to superimpose a particular value system on your clients. It's about your clients learning to be who they are. It's not about trying to create clones of yourself, ideological or intellectual clones of yourself. Like, every client is going to be my little clone. I'm going to try to turn my clients into people who think like I do and believe like I do and behave like I do. And, you know, kind of like Agent Smith in the Matrix series of movies, who's like putting his hand into people and sort of they get sort of gooped up and turned into versions of Agent Smith. It's like, come on, man, life is deeper than that. The same paradigm is true, by the way, of your college classes. Like, hopefully your college classes don't turn into another Agent Smith, like your professors putting their hand into your mind and trying to generate intellectual clones of themselves. I hope this doesn't happen in this class. My God, I want to take a minute maybe to warn you, like, if it's starting to happen, it's like, yeah, that's not the deep point of this class. The deep point of this class is for you to become yourself, okay? A little bit more faithfully and a little bit more fully. So, culmination statement by Rogers. That was a little bit of a rant, I guess, of, you know, there's my own value structure in there. I believe that it's okay ultimately for you to live your life. All right, you don't have to live my life. You don't have to live anyone else's life. Ultimately, what it's about is coming into your unique, unduplicatable form of participation in the universe. Okay? All right. So Rogers says, for his culmination statement, I guess that was mine, he goes, oh, I love this. Carl, dude, hella dope, man. I can only try to live by my interpretation of my experience and try to give others permission and freedom to develop their own inward freedom. Whew, you could do a lot worse, you know, if you wanted to make that sort of the leitmotif of your life. You could do worse than that, you know, but ultimately it's not about your becoming Carl Rogers either. It's about your using Carl Rogers, using me, using all your other teachers to find your own best path in life, which, you know, no matter what we tell you, that's what your challenge is going to be anyhow. So I guess I'd like to end by, you know, striking a positive note. You know, I think you're doing all right. You're going to make some mistakes. We all make mistakes. People of my boomer generation made plenty of mistakes. You know, we sometimes forget that. People of my boomer generation, when we cast aspersions, as we sometimes do, on people of your Zoomer, Gen Z type generation, I don't think any of that's warranted. I think for the most part we've forgotten what it's like to be 20 years old. So I don't want to slip into that trap as your teacher and your professor. So I'd rather end this video on a note of affirmation. You're doing all right. You're going to make mistakes. So did we. All right? So did we. So we're all in this human adventure together. And in the final analysis, actually, we're a lot more like you than we are different from you. Okay. Have a good day. Bye-bye.